This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 98. Monetary versus fiscal policy. Which one works best?
Hello and welcome once again to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie, and today, monetary policy versus fiscal policy. Which one works best when it comes to controlling inflation, keeping unemployment in check, and avoiding a recession? Or do either of them really work at all? That's today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Now, Steve, central banks like to control inflation using monetary theory, in other words, working on the cost of borrowing as their way to control inflation and unemployment and to avoid recessions. Whereas Keynes, and Steve Keen, I think, as well, he argues that government spending is the way to avoid recessions, to pump prime the economy. And she'll be right, mate. So first of all, Steve, does monetary theory work?
Yeah, it works beautifully well for central banks who want to employ conventional economists. Unfortunately, it doesn't work at all well for the economy. I think in this sense, we've had one of probably the best empirical tests of a theory you could ever hope for, because really since the late 1980s, maybe even earlier than that, the neoclassical emphasis on trying to reject fiscal policy and say the government should do nothing to control the economy whatsoever, left it with one thing they said it should do, which is to control interest rates. And this is the whole idea of, I think it's called the Taylor rule, after the mainstream economists who first suggested that this is what central banks have been doing, so let's make it policy. And then this policy, though it never actually explicitly adopted, turned up in the equations that mainstream economists used to model the economy. So what Taylor realized was that if you look at the decisions of central banks over time, it had been set with a target inflation rate of about 2%. And there was the number 2 turned up several times in the simple equation, but they would be influenced also between the gap between what they called actual output and potential output. In other words, the output level that would apply if full employment applied, and the rate of change of inflation. And this Taylor rule was seen as they never explicitly, well, some central banks did explicitly say we're following it, but most of them didn't explicitly say we're doing it, but all the models that their economists put together had the Taylor rule as the one variable that the government was allowed to control, and that was all in the hand of central banks, who were staffed by neoclassical economists, and the central banks were independent of the politicians, and it was all supposed to be absolutely hunky-dory and lead to a lovely, stable capitalist system.
Right. But there is a relationship, isn't there, between inflation and the level of unemployment, though? Or do you say that they're not related to each other?
This comes back to the argument of the Phillips curve, which is somewhat tangential, but yes, it's part of the argument is that the level of employment will change how much workers can demand wage rises. And literally every theory of economics, to some degree, has this. You go right back to Karl Marx, you get a similar argument that workers' capacity to bargain for wage rises depends upon the level of employment. But it became, this is a whole other rabbit hole. You like going down rabbit holes, though, don't you?
Yeah, we do. We always do.
Stop me when. And this rabbit hole was one of the greatest and most misinterpreted economists of all time was a New Zealander called Bill Phillips. And Bill Phillips was actually an engineer by training, and quite a brilliant engineer. To give you an idea of how brilliant he was, and this is all taken from his biography written by an Australian economist called Robert Leeson. At one stage, Phillips was captured during the Second World War by the Japanese, interred on a Japanese prisoner of war camp, which happened to be an island. On the island, he found a derelict bus, which he spent his spare time trying to turn into a boat to escape. That plan didn't particularly get anywhere, but at one point, all the British prisoners were enjoying it, and as one should, a nice hot cup of tea. And the nice hot cup of tea was being generated by components that Phillips had stolen from the commandant's office, which meant he could actually tap into the electricity system of the camp and seal some of it to heat up tea for the inmates. And he also even managed to put together a functional radio system so that they could listen to broadcasts, not the propaganda of the Japanese about how well the war was going going for them, but radio broadcasts from shortwave, obviously, from the BBC and other sources giving rather more accurate reports of what was happening. Back in the day when BBC actually gave accurate reports.
All right, in those good old days.
That's the old days. So this fabulous man retrained to become an economist, and he applied his ideas of engineering and circuit diagrams, basically the same sort of stuff that I design in Minsky these days. He designed those, applied those ideas to build a model of the economy, which had as part of that model, and only as one particular component, an argument that what he called factor incomes, not just wages, but incomes of capitalists, incomes of raw materials producers and so on, their prices would rise with the rising level of economic activity. And he literally hand drew a little curve there, which was non-linear. So it tapered to zero at basically like a hyperbola. It went flat and then it went vertical when you had high levels of employment. And then to actually try to put this, to go from having just a hand drawing to something based on data, he went back to data from the UK from 1863 to 1917, I think it was, assembled a whole lot of data on the unemployment rate and the rate of wage change by looking at union data, because at that stage the government did not collect this information. The unions were the only ones who knew how many people were out of work in the UK. And using that data curve designed from, as I said, I think 1863 to 1917, he then interpolated it to data from 1953, I think from somewhere around 50s to the 60s, and it fitted the actual current data like a glove. Now, he made a fatal mistake in saying it looks like we've got a menu choice here. If we want full employment of, say 3% of the people out of work in the UK, which would be regarded as frictional unemployment, then we need a rate of inflation of 4%. And if you want to have zero, if you want to have zero wage change, you need an unemployment rate of 5%, like a menu choice. And politicians saw this and think, oh, great, this is simple. We just say, what do we want? Do we want the spicy menu with low unemployment and slightly high inflation? Or do you want the bland menu with higher unemployment but no inflation? We can make a choice between the two, and it will stay there.
Right.
And this became the way the Phillips curve is interpreted, completely misinterpreting the idea behind it. And also forgetting the part that he said it was non-linear. So all this stuff turns up now in so-called modern dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. They have an equation which implies that by varying the rate of interest, you can vary the level of economic activity, and by varying that, you vary the rate of inflation. So you can hit this sweet spot, which they're always aiming for. This is where my argument, you can summarise their theories in three numbers. They want a 2% rate of inflation, a 3% rate of real economic growth, and a 4% rate of interest, giving you a nominal rate, giving a 2% real rate. That's their target.
Right.
And this is what they thought they could do by monetary policy.
Right. Well, let's hear just a quick word from the man who perhaps was responsible for monetary policy. Let's go back to I guess this would be the 1970s. This is Milton Friedman.
I just want to settle for once and for all the point that inflation is a monetary phenomenon. That proposition has been documented over and over again. We have evidence for the United States for over 100 years, for Great Britain for 200 years, for Sweden for 200 years. There has never in history been an inflation that was not accompanied by an extremely rapid increase in the quantity of money. There has never in history been an extremely rapid increase in the quantity of money without an inflation.
So he's right on that, isn't he? That the relationship between the amount of money and the level of inflation?
You know, I can actually just... I knew it was going to be Milton Friedman. I was bracing myself. There's actually been a very interesting recent piece on this argument done by one of my bloggers. I've got one of my Twitter correspondents. I've got to go back and check. And so I think it was Cameron Murray who put it up there. To argue Milton Friedman's proposition that it's always a monetary phenomenon, what he was working with was called the quantity theory of money equation. And though mainstream economists will deny that they still use it, it's still fundamentally in the background of their thinking. And that said that you can break output into prices times the number of transactions on one side of the equation, and on the other side it'll be equal to the amount of money times the velocity of circulation of money. Now, an essential part of Friedman making that claim he made, and of course he convinced Maggie Thatcher and he convinced Ronald Reagan, and it became the practice of monetary policy in the 70s and 80s. He convinced them that equation implied that government money creation caused inflation, because he argued empirically that the velocity of money was a constant. So this equation has, pardon me being mathematical on a verbal discussion, but prices times transactions was equal to money times velocity, and therefore he differentiated the whole lot and said that transactions you can regard as being set by basically barter operations between people. That's the level of transactions can't be affected by monetary policy. That was assumption one. Secondly, velocity is constant. That's assumption two. And therefore, the change in prices is totally given by the change in money. And if you then also assume that the government was the only money creator, that was where the idea of helicopter money came from. The system, helicopter being outside the economy, dropping money in. Therefore, the inflation rate was entirely due to the government creating too much money. And all you had to do was reduce the rate of government money creation, and that would reduce the rate of inflation without affecting the level of real economic activity, yada, yada, yada. And an essential part of that was the idea that velocity is a constant.
Right, which it's not, now, of course, because we've seen it reduced so much.
Which it's not. And not even that. This is why I'm mentioning the comment from one of my Twitter correspondents recently. Again, I think Cameron and Murray, we'll check it up and put it on the Patreon blog for people to see. Milton did a graph to show this stability of velocity of money over time. The left-hand scale of the graph was between 0 and 10. Velocity was varying between 1 and 3. Now, if you put 0 to 10 as your range, and the actual range of the data is 0 to 3 or 1 to 3, what you get is looks like a pretty flat line. But if you reset the scale to say, well, what's the maximum minimum range of this whole thing, it's volatile. So he even fudged the way he presented his own data.
So if his scale was 1 to 3 rather than 1 to 10, then it wouldn't look so flat. It would look
obviously was not a constant. Obviously not a constant, quite variable. And later work by more empirically honest, even though they were ideologically probably even more right-wing than Milton Friedman, honest researchers, Kydland and Prescott, who were two winners of the Nobel Prize in economics for creating real business cycle models which gave birth to the DSG models of today. Their conclusion was that velocity was highly volatile and pro-cyclical. In other words, velocity rose during a boom and fell during a slump. Now that blows a Hiroshima bomb-size hole through Milton Friedman's argument that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, i.e. change in inflation due to change in level of money, not due to any change in rates of circulation. That's simply empirically false. And on top of that, he left out the actual creation mechanisms of money. He assumed that money was only created by the government. Now, this is finally, I no longer have to quote obscure economists like myself or the recently deceased and truly dear departed Basil Moore, or Hyman Minsky or Wynne Godley to make this case. I can quote the Bank of England and the Bundesbank. Yeah. And this is one reason why the conventional economists are being so resistant to admitting the importance of saying that banks create money, private banks create money, is that it blows a hole in the entire edifice.
So let's look at how central banks operate now in terms of their policy. So we obviously they work on the basis of either an expansionary policy or a contractionary policy. An expansionary policy, and let's ignore the role of debt in all of this to start with. Let's assume that there's a country has no debt problem. So an expansionary policy, lower interest rates. The idea is if we lower interest rates, there's going to be more credit, and therefore businesses expand. That creates jobs. Is that right? Is the theory right behind that?
It's right to some degree, but it's incredibly mild, because what it's arguing is the determinant of the level of investment is the rate of interest. And the proposition here is that a firm has a range of projects that it's considering undertaking. It works out the cash flow it expects from those projects over time, and then it discounts them by the interest rate. So if you increase the interest rate, you increase how much you're discounting your future cash flows. And if the interest rate falls, you you get a higher cash flow. So varying the interest rate fine-tunes the level of business investment. That is nonsense for the simple reason that, yes, interest rates do matter and discount does matter, but far more important about determining how much investment firms are going to undertake is how confident they are of the economic situation they're in. If they have high expectations, they're going to invest like crazy. Low expectations, they won't invest at all. It's their expectations of profit that determine far more so than the rate of interest.
But aren't they? But wouldn't interest rates determine what that level of confidence is? I mean, if your interest rates are lower, you're going to say, well, this is a good time to borrow. Therefore, you'd be nuts not to, wouldn't you?
Well, it's much more complex again than the models make out, because if interest rates are low, it's normally because the economy's then fallen into a hole. And now, because what we do have is central banks dramatically, well, they used to very dramatically vary interest rates by 1% in every, quarterly, every monthly meeting. They might vary the rate of interest by 1%, which is huge variability in the rate of interest. These days they vary by 0.25%, but they've been at zero for the last 10 years. Now, they've been at zero the last 10 years praying that would lead to an increase in investment. And one of the reasons why a number of mainstream economists are finally saying, look, there must be something wrong with our models, because we've been doing this for 10 years and it hasn't given us anything like the bang for our buck we thought it would give. This is where people like Narayana Koshalakotta, who was an extremely conservative economist as president of the Minneapolis Fed, which was the most conservative of all the 13 Federal Reserve central banks that make up the Federal Reserve System. He finally came out and said that given the quote-unquote highly surprising nature of the data of the last decade, we simply do not have a settled model of the economy. So the empirical, this is why I could use all sorts of theoretical arguments here, but I want to come back to the empirical track record. A decade of zero interest rates has not led to the boost in investment that was being expected. Investment is still at a very low level historically. Certainly in Britain, it's at an incredibly low level. America, it's recovered to some degree, but nothing like as much as their models were always predicting it would recover to.
Well, that's why I said it. Let's ignore the question of debt, because isn't that actually the issue? Isn't it the fact that because we're carrying so much household and private debt, that's why we're not seeing this. Would this model work if debt was very low? But the fact that it's so high means there isn't that confidence to spend.
Mate, you're stealing my thunder here.
Sorry, I've been doing so many of these now. I can just interview myself. You could. But I was wondering, without the debt issue, are they right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, if you could get rid of the debt issue, their model would start working again, because they're leaving out the role of credit completely. They're ignoring credit as a component of aggregate demand, and they're ignoring the level of debt, private debt, as a drag on demand of the economy, because they think, well, if there's an increase in debt, well, therefore the lenders have got more money to spend, and the borrowers have got more money to spend, and the lenders have less. It evens out. If debt falls, the borrowers have got more, and the lenders have got less, because they're getting less revenue from the money they've lent out. So it comes down to saying you can ignore it. It swings and roundabouts, and one up, one down, no effective credit, and no need to worry about the level of private debt. Both absolutely wrong, because to go back to that equation of Milton Friedman's, price times transactions equals M times V, that equation is wrong incomplete once you include the role of private debt, as I have done. This is a simple, logically, mathematically derived, because change in debt creates an identical increase in the money supply, credit-based money. The actual equation is price times transactions equals money times velocity plus the change in debt.
Right.
And when the change in debt, as it was in America's case in 2007, hits 15% of GDP, that's a very, very big factor to be ignoring, particularly when it's the most volatile factor. So it went from being plus 15 in 2008 to minus 6 in 2010.
Right. So that's monetary theory, monetary policy, which might work if we didn't have debt to get in the way. So it needs to be modified, is what you're saying. So what about the other side of the coin, which is looking at fiscal measures, which basically translates to government spending being one way of avoiding recessions? Let me play you another sound clip. you might like this actually, as to whether government, because the big problem, of course, is the moment we start looking at government spending, as in fact we are in America right now with Donald Trump, is that people start to get worried about the level of government debt, and when does that become an issue? So who am I going to play you a sound clip from? Have a listen from this from America's greatest investor, a man who knows a bit about money, I suspect, Warren Buffett.
All of our debt is printed in our own currency. I mean, that's the key. And then the question is, do you abuse that in some way so that the currency declines in value at a rapid rate? Well, interestingly enough, I was born in 1930. The dollar from 1930 is worth about 6 cents today. So I've lived during a period where the dollar's lost 94% of its value in terms of purchasing power. And yet at the same time, in real terms, the GDP of the country per capita has gone up 6 for 1. So we've had 6 for 1. Just think of that, one person's lifetime. We went centuries in the world where the gains were in nothing in a century, or a few percent, and 6 for 1 in one person's lifetime. At the same time, our currency has decreased, by 94%, and that, despite all of that, we are the world's reserve currency, and people are willing to lend us money for nothing, virtually, currently in large sums, and I do not see that changing unless we do something incredibly foolish. Now, we have to stabilize the debt as a percentage of GDP, which means we can have debt increase by 2 to 3% a year if GDP grows 2 to 3% a year. And I think that's a very realistic possibility. We can't keep having debt grow at a faster rate than GDP, although it can go on for a long time, and it has gone on for a long time.
So there we are, Warren Buffett basically saying, well, you do need debt to drive growth.
Yeah, listen, I'd take my hat off to Warren Buffett for wisdom like that. I knew from his work in finance for decades that the guy was able to see through bullshit. And that's a simple empirical statement of saying this has happened over time. And here are all these hard money, sound money types saying, we'll all be ruined because the value of fiat money is going to zero. He points out, well, it has fallen dramatically over my lifetime. However, real income has risen by a factor of 6 in the same time period. If that's failure, let's continue failing. and that is also, when you mentioned growing by 2 or 3% of GDP, that is something else which I think is quite, it just shows how damn good the man's mind is. Because when I looked at the role of, what should the level of government, what should the level of money creation be by the government, then of course the modern monetary theory basically says the government create as much money as it needs to enable full employment to occur. And that's where the huge fights are occurring between modern monetary theorists, with whom I am consistent. I have some disputes, as we both know, but I think their accounting logic is clearly sound. Disputes with them and the sound money people to say, anything more than in any deficit at all is really, really bad, and we handicap our kids, etc., etc. He said a rate of about 2 or 3% per annum. When I modelled,
well, he's basically saying, it's ideal if it's below your rate of GDP growth. But then also saying, but actually, it's been bad for a while, and it doesn't seem to be causing too many problems.
But what he was getting close to was what I found when I did my modelling of the money creation level, given an economy which is expanding over time. What level of government money creation work sustain a stable economy over time? And it was the nominal rate of economic growth divided by the velocity of circulation of money. That's your target. So rather than the target for the difference between government spending and government taxation being zero, which is the argument of the hard money people, the argument of the European Central Bank, what's been enshrined in the Maastricht Treaty, the obsession of all the politicians around the world, including Theresa May, not Donald Trump, obviously. They have a target of zero. I'm saying that target should be the nominal rate of economic growth you want, which is roughly of the order of 5 or 6% of GDP, divided by the velocity of circulation of money, which is roughly 2 or 3. And then you say if the government spending is 2% of GDP more than taxation, that is a level which may give you, surprise, surprise, a tranquil capitalist economy, which is what central banks are trying to achieve by their interest rate shenanigans, which are based on a completely fallacious model.
Right. So are you saying in that case, if we followed that, we wouldn't need to follow the monetary theory approach, or how do the two work side by side? And that was sort of what I wanted to get to. There's two approaches here. There's the monetary theory, and there's and then the fiscal approach. How do you get the balance between the two, or do you just throw one of them away?
No, you realise that the interest rate control is far less powerful than the neoclassicals believed. They really thought they could fine-tune the economy by varying the interest rate twice as fast as inflation was varying fundamentally. So if inflation was going from 2% to 3%, the interest rate should go from, say, 4% to 6%. And they thought that would stabilise the whole thing. It was just a question of getting the price level right. And transactions would take care of themselves because this is a capitalist economy, therefore it's always in equilibrium. Can't you see equilibrium everywhere? That was their thinking. In fact, it was far more complex than that. And the monetary policy does have real effects. And they thought it was just the interest rate that mattered. What's coming out of empirical data, the failure of their policies for the last 20 years, and the wisdom of people like Warren Buffett, is that you need government money creation as well as some manipulation of the rate of interest. But fundamentally, the neoclassical vision right from Milton Friedman on was to get rid of fiscal policy. And there's yet another element about that we might talk about, which is the idea of what they call Ricardian equivalence, which argued fiscal policy had zero effect whatsoever. And during the crisis, you had a guy called, I think, Alessandro Alesi, pardon me for getting his name here, which is a good thing. He was arguing that a fiscal cutback, so running a government surplus, taxing more than you spend, could actually stimulate the economy. Completely false, but again, grabbed hold of by the hard money mob to argue that running a government surplus, it's the sort of stuff Cameron and Osborne were trying to do in 2010 to 2015 in the UK, that'd be good for the economy. It stimulated garbage. It caused the slowest recovery from a downturn in the UK's history. All these policies are abject failures, and these are all attempts by mainstream economists to say fiscal policy doesn't matter, just use monetary policy to control the rate of inflation, leave the real economy to itself. What we've learned from the empirical outcomes of the last 20 or 30 years is that you need fiscal policy which creates additional money, and you need some control over the rate of interest as a potentially having some impact on the rate of inflation, but nothing like the level that neoclassical theory assumes it has.
Right. So if you're too expansionary in your, not expansionary is probably the wrong word, but if you are pushing too much fiscal stimulus, then you perhaps need to influence interest rates so that you're not getting runaway inflation as a result of it.
And you also have inflation coming from wage push or resource push pressures. This is again going back to Phillips's point, which was not just about wages, but also about raw material supplies and so on. And this also turns up in non-orthodox economics and post-Keynesian economics. One thing we will accept is that, in general, prices are set as a markup over the primary cost of production, which, in a modelling sense, does come down to the impact of wage demand and raw material demands. So prices are a markup on wage costs in the simplest possible model, a markup on wage costs. And because most firms face declining costs as they increase output, they have excess capacity, they can actually reduce their prices when there's an economic boom going on. So you don't actually get much price pressure coming from corporations themselves. Where you do get the price pressure from workers who can find the demand for more of a share of the surplus with the bargaining power they get out of higher wages, but also raw materials producers, because raw materials are not produced but in a situation of declining costs. If you want to pump out oil more rapidly from a oil reservoir, you do have to change the pressure settings. You do have to dig more coal at a deeper seams and stuff like that. And so the energy costs do rise, and that's the combination of wage pressures with very high employment plus raw material pressures, because finally OPEC could be formed and the Arabs could cease being screwed by the four sisters of oil as they were before the 1973 conflict with Israel. Those pressures are what gave us inflation in the late 70s and early 80s. And that's what gave rise to the belief that we could control it using monetary policy. Well, there's one failed experiment for you.
So it's sort of, from what you're saying, I mean, the power, the influence is sitting with the government and not with the central bank. Makes you wonder, is there much of a role for central banks in that case? Because you certainly wouldn't want to say to central banks, well, okay, you can set how much the government is going to spend. So do you bring in the idea that, well, maybe governments control interest rates if we believe they still have a role to play? But certainly separating out the two doesn't make a great deal of sense, does it?
No, it's certainly what you have is the argument that government should control the creation of government money and should have targets based on the level of government money they want to inject into the economy through fiscal spending, which has to be financed by the central bank. So there is a collaborative role between the two institutions, creating additional money when the economy is in a slump, and for reducing that rate of creation when it's in a boom, and also for keeping a very careful eye on the level of private debt, because you don't want that to exceed, in my opinion, not totally empirically worked out, you don't want it to exceed about 70% of GDP. Now, it's currently, for America, 150%. Australia, it's 220%. We've broken through that, what I would set as my Milton Friedman rule. I would be setting that rate 1/3 to 1/2 where we've got ourselves into.
Right. All right. Very good. Well, you and Warren Buffett need to get together and sort out the problems of the world, because it sounds like you're singing from the same hymn sheet. He is a smart guy, isn't he?
He's an extremely smart guy, and like I remember one statement I've seen from him at one point was to say that he was challenged by people that he couldn't make money on the stock market because there was no money to be made because stock markets were efficient, by which economists don't mean what normal people mean by the word, saying that prices encapsulated all available information, so there was no information asymmetry or anything else to exploit. And Warren said, well, that's true, I'm going to be a very poor man. I don't think to see any more than that, do I?
No, and actually a good lead-in, because we are going to talk about information asymmetry next time on the Debunking Economics podcast. Good to talk, Steve.
Indeed, mate.
Yeah. Is there a power in having more information than everybody else? Well, obviously there is, but how much does that influence the income spread in the economy? And is it a good thing or a bad thing? Some interesting questions for us to tackle next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you again soon.